The devastation of the patriarchy. Since the beginning of the United States of America, from the Pilgrims to today's technology-infused society, men have found themselves at the top of the totem pole. This has been brought up as an issue in our society because it does not include the independent voice of women. We have seen examples of patriarchy throughout history, but one example that should be mentioned is the ruling of Roe v. Wade. This was a Supreme Court case where a woman challenged a district attorney over their unconstitutional methods when handling abortion. The case was ruled in favor of the women but later overturned in June 2022. This would display the patriarchy's ideas such as that women do not have a voice, let alone have their own opinions on their bodies. This is just one example of how patriarchy has diminished society. Although we live in a world where the problems are clear to see, it remains difficult for minorities to have a voice, especially women. With that being said, the patriarchy needs to go because of its gender inequality, structural oppression, and the negative impact that it can have on men. It will be explained by myself, Snoop D-O-double-G. So just sit back and listen to the straight facts I'm about to spit. For starters, it needs to be understood where this concept originated. The male demographic has always been a part of the dominance. Throughout our lives, we have heard that the men are responsible for the labor, while the women are responsible for cooking/cleaning. This idea has been around since 800 BC onward and is still practiced on now. It is more verbal rather than action. As Lerner stated, the archaic states were organized in the form of patriarchy. Thus, from its inception, the state had an essential interest in the maintenance of the patriarchal family. Even the formation and coming of our government was in the sole interest of men. Women were not allowed to have a voice for a great period with the formation of the states. This dominant ideology of men even translated towards slavery, as they put forth the hierarchy that was imposed on women and expressed it through their slaves. If we think back to medieval times, kings would always have the most power and were always a man. Often the king would have mistresses to please them and would only have wives even if some they met that day for the use of pleasure in birthing an heir to the king born. Sexual habits were often monitored, and women's sexual ordination would often reside around the rules of men, meaning they could not perform sexual acts on the same gender, even if they did not swing that, if you know what I mean. The history explains why there is such a gender disparity in the patriarchy, and that men shall always rule over women, creating systematic barriers and limited opportunities for every aspect of their lives. Roe v. Wade could be used as an example of the structural oppression that the patriarchy causes. But let us just discuss the basics of marriage. For a long time, and even in some states today, gay marriage was not legal. The system developed a foundation, essentially stating that men and women have to marry each other and that there cannot be any variance of this matter. Say you do marry a woman as a man, more often than not, marriage will allow the man to have greater control over property and finances. Something as little as signing a document often calls for the husband to sign rather than the wife. It should be stated that women are starting to make waves in society and that standards are starting to change. However, with marriage, some of these waves are left on mute and will often be tossed aside for the man's ideology. Although a different perspective, men can be negatively impacted by the patriarchy as well. I know the point of the argument is that men have more privilege over women. However, this also means they are stuck with expectations that they must adhere to, or they can be at risk for discrimination. For example, often it is difficult for a male to come out as gay because they will often face ridicule. This ridicule is fueled by patriarchy because of the traditional beliefs that it lays over our society. Dominance and success can be associated with men, and as soon as you start to challenge these basic concepts, then you will be put on the chopping block. Men have to carry themselves a certain way so that they are perceived in a certain way. I could make arguments on how the patriarchy created a false definition of manhood, and that with the addition of religion, men must adhere to these values. According to the National Institute of Health, a large section of the male population faces incessant pressure to go against their natural inclinations and behave according to acceptable stereotypes. If a boy poses feminine traits, then they could face bullying, so this will often lead to the suppression of their emotions, and then it causes a slippery slope. So there you have it, the patriarchy needs to go. In order for society to remain cohesive, these expectations for men and women have to change. There does not have to be a dominant gender. There doesn't have to be any disparity. And we can make our expectations based on how we are as a person. Because of gender inequality, structural oppression, and the negative impact it can have on men, we should abolish the patriarchy and stand up for what is right.